Okay, so as Brian said, this is a webinar on time-lapse photography. It's something that, as a photographer, I'm just extremely passionate about. I'm not sure why. I think it's just the movement, the excitement, the you create something you're not sure what you're going to get after you edit it all together and put it together. But it's something I just kind of started, casually several years back. I think like 2007 or 2008, and I've just, just kind of been doing it on the side for fun. I go on trips, and I went to Utah last year, and I put together a nice little video of the whole thing. Most of it was time lapse. Some of it was some GoPro video spliced into it. And I just really enjoy it, and I thought I'd share. I know it's one of those topics that a lot of people have a lot of questions on, because until you really kind of wrap your head around the thing and the whole, intervals and how to edit the video and actually create the time lapse movies, it's a little bit complicated. So I wanted to do a webinar on it to share what I know. I just thought I'd start with kind of sharing what just the real basic of what time lapse photography is. So time-lapse photography in a nutshell is capturing still frames at a low frame rate and then playing them back at a normal frame rate, like what we see on TV, so the video appears to be moving quickly. Like if you kind of look at the world around, imagine you're seeing everything at 24 frames per second. But if you were to create 1 frame per second, and like if you were to create an image, everything is just 1 frame per second and then play it back, then it stretches out, and it's anyways. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. I think I'm going to jump into that later when I get to my interval section, but that's the basic behind what time-lapse photography is. And if anyone is familiar with slow motion photography, it's the opposite of that. So if you hear about these fancy 10,000 frames per second camera, when you play those back at 30 frames per second, everything moves really, really, really slowly. So if you can understand that concept, think of it in the reverse, and that's what time-lapse is. All right, when you, just like with any kind of photography, you need to really plan out what you're going to photograph. And scouting your scene is a big one. Some of the things, actually the biggest thing with time-lapse photography is movement. You need to have something moving in your frame in order for it actually to be a worthwhile time lapse and to actually look good. Whether it's the subject moving, a big one, clouds, that's probably one of the biggest things that you'll see moving. People, if you're in a scene where there are a lot of people moving around, or cars with traffic. If you have a scene where something's going to be built, like maybe you're painting a wall, anything where things are going to move and change, those make really, really good time lapses. Another thing that you can do is have your camera move. Now, this is something that you actually need separate equipment for, and it can get really expensive, but it creates a really beautiful panning look to an image. So that's another way, and usually you're going to have also some type of movement within that. You see a lot of people online creating these panning time-lapse videos with night photography. So they're doing, star photography where the stars are moving in the sky, or the Milky Way is going across the sky, and then the camera's moving at the same time, and it's just these epic, amazing video productions. That can get kind of expensive. I'll get into that a little later, talking about some of the equipment. You can do it in software, so there are workarounds so you don't have to have the extra equipment. And lastly, the position of your camera is also important. If you want to show a lot of movement, then putting yourself on like a rooftop or really high up somewhere, you're going to see a lot more movement than if you were closer to the ground. Unless you're photographing something like clouds and you want to show the clouds or the movement, then you just would be on the ground, of course, shooting up just like with the landscape or anything like that. Okay, the next section here, this is talking about intervals, and this is where it gets a little complicated. So I'm going to do my best to try and explain this, and if anyone has any questions about this, I'm happy to answer questions. So I'm going to try and move through this a little slowly so I can articulate what I'm trying to say and make sure everyone understands it. All right, to start, You really just have to understand the basic video frame rate. Videos, most video is either 24 frames per second or 30 frames per second. That's usually the stuff you're going to see on TVs or movies. Sometimes it's a little bit different online. You can use any frame rate you want, but those are the standard ones, and those are usually the ones that I use when I'm creating my videos. What that means is each still image equals one video frame. So let's say just with a standard video camera, it's creating 24 still frames every single second. So that way when they play it back, it streams like normal video, and it's not choppy, and everything moves at the same pace. And like I said, it determines how smooth your video will be. If you were to play something, it's okay, 24 frames per second is a very smooth video. It's very normal. Our eyes process that so it looks normal. If you were to drop that down to one, or just to kind of go to the extreme, 1 or 2 frames per second, it's just going to be chop, 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 chop. You know, it's just going to be these frames like flickering on the screen. Move, 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 move. You're going to see it. That's how our eyes work. We see those things. So that's kind of just the basics behind how video frame rate works. Now, when it comes to actually creating the time lapse, you will be shooting intervals on. You'll set your camera to shoot in intervals. And the interval that you set determines the speed of your time lapse. And I don't mean the frame rate, I mean how quickly the elements in your time lapse in your video actually move. And so I've got a few examples to kind of show this. A short interval, like every 2 seconds, which is a very, this is one that I use a lot because most of the time I'm going to be showing clouds or something that's just moving at a normal pace. That's going to equal a slower video, and what I mean by that is the elements in the frame are not going to move as much, and it's what you probably see a lot of the time. Shorter intervals, like clouds moving or people walking, they're normal. People aren't moving, they're not going a mile every second, they're going 10 feet every second. So let's say you wanted to shoot an interval or a time lapse every 2 seconds. In order to get 10 seconds of finished video, you have to stand there with your camera for 10 minutes, shooting 1 frame every 2 seconds. So that way when you bring all of those frames together, you're going to get 10 seconds of video. Now, on the opposite side of that, longer intervals, let's say 20 seconds or more. I mean, you could get as long as you want. Depending on your location and your equipment, you could go every 20 seconds, you could go every day, you could go whatever. But that's going to equal a faster video, and what I mean by faster video is the elements in your frame, the subjects, are going to appear to be moving much more quickly. And a good example is, let's say you wanted to do a time lapse of someone building a house. If you were to do that in a short interval, you'd have a really long time lapse because it would take them in 10 minutes of shooting, you'd get 10 seconds of video, but they're not really going to do much in 10 minutes. So if you wanted to create 10 seconds of video, you're going to have to stand there for several days and take a frame every day or a few frames every day. So for this example, if you wanted to create 10 seconds of video, if you're doing a 20-second interval, so you're doing 1 frame every 20 seconds, if you want to create 10 seconds of finalized video, you need to stand with your camera shooting for 1 hour and 40 minutes. So you're basically creating the exact amount of frames in these 2 examples. It's just taking you longer to shoot, obviously, the every 20-second interval than it would for the every 2-second interval. So, are there any questions on that, Brian?
Really, regarding that, I know Lori asked if either of us know any iPhone apps to calculate intervals and how long it would take. I was looking into that, but I also posted a kind of a blurb in the chat session that most television programs, pretty much all of television, is 30 frames per second, whereas movies
Hmm.
are typically at 24 frames per second, and that's
Yeah.
primarily to give you that cinematic feel. So I wanted to give that in there as well. But you're good
Yeah.
to go.
Okay. Yeah, well, just to kind of comment on the iPhone app, I've seen a few. I don't have any on my I don't have any on my iPhone, but I think that there's one that I've seen, but it'll only calculate like over 2 minutes of time, or it was something weird like that. So, but I did find some. You know what? I had a list of some websites, and I completely forgot to post them out. But maybe we can put those like in the YouTube video later or something, so people can find those. All right, so moving on, I'm
Quickly,
going to get
actually,
into the fun stuff.
let me just
The
jump in there for a
equipment.
second.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, a few people did jump in that they were saying that there's an app called Time-lapse. John said that, and another one just called Time-lapse by Tim. And I totally forgot. I think Randall reminded me that I believe that the remote control that I use that does intervalometers, and so I think it tells you based on your frames per second how long it'll take. So
Cool. Yeah, and I will say that when most of the time lapse that I'm doing it every 2 seconds. So it's really pretty easy for me to process in my brain what that is. Because if it's, let's see, if I can do this on the fly, if I'm gonna shoot every 2 seconds, that means if I round it, if I want to do 30 frames per second, that means every minute of shooting is 1 second of exposure. So I can kind of do that in my head, real quickly. If I know I've been standing somewhere doing a 2 second interval and I've been there for 15 minutes, I'm going to get approximately 15 seconds. Usually I export at 24 frames per second, so I get a little bit more than that. But that just is a way for me to do it. But if I ever get into any longer ones, then, or especially if you're doing any nighttime photography, because then you're not just taking if you want to know how long you're going to be standing out there, you have to take into consideration how long your exposure is, and you're not just doing a 1/30th of a second exposure. When you're doing night photography, you're doing like a 30 second or maybe even more. So, okay, I'm going to go ahead and jump into the equipment that I use when I'm in order, and what most people use when they're doing time lapse. The Other than the camera, one of the most important things you need is some type of intervalometer. This is what's actually going to allow your camera to automatically fire, a frame every X amount of seconds. Now, some cameras have internal intervalometers. Nikon is one. I actually used to have Nikon, and that's when I started getting into time lapse. So I had a D200 several years ago before I switched over to Canon. And you can do everything internally. I'm not sure what the limitations are. I don't really remember. But just so you know, if you do have a Nikon SLR, more than likely you're able to do this internally with your camera. For those of us who use Canon, if we want to do it internally, there are workarounds. And I believe okay, it's called Magic Lantern. What it is, it's a firmware that you install onto your SD or CF card, and then you put that in your camera, and the camera reads off of the card, and then it allows you to do intervals internally without having to use any kind of cable release. Um, I don't think they have it for the 7D. I don't think it's available for Nikon. I'm not sure about the other camera types. I know for a fact it's available for a lot of the Canon cameras. I have it on my 60D, and the oh, because I broke my I broke my external cable release, and so I needed something to use. And so instead of buying a new cable release, I thought I'd try the Magic Lantern, and I really like it. So if you just Google Magic Lantern, I think it's like Wiki Magic Lantern Wiki or something like that. So, and it's free. It's a donation based thing. So if you really like it, then go in and go ahead and donate some money to them. But I'm not sponsored by anything. I'm just kind of passing along some good information there. All right, and of course, you can have an external intervalometer. I believe Canon and Nikon both have them. The Canon brand. I'll speak to that because I know it's pretty expensive. I think it's like 150 or something. There are other third-party brands you can get, and if you want to go extremely third-party, there's one from linkdelight.com, and I believe it's from China. And here's a photo of it. I had this. I had this for a while, and it works really well. It's only $20, and just don't drop it in water like I did, and you'll be fine. So, but it's pretty cool. It does other things too. It has, it's just a normal cable release as well. And kind of back to the Magic Lantern, Magic Lantern does way more than just intervals. So if you are interested in kind of playing with some other things, extended bracketing, focus stacking, all sorts of things, then the Magic Lantern is fun. But so those are some options for intervalometers. And just to kind of touch briefly on the camera and lenses, because obviously we need a camera and lenses to do this. SLRs that's all I've ever used as far as any kind of camera. I've never tried it with the point and shoot. I don't have any real point and shoots that I could even try it with. I'm gonna guess that there might be some. If you can plug some kind of external intervalometer into it, like the cable releases I just mentioned, you may be able to do some other, use another kind of camera. But SLRs I think are the best. You can, of course, also use GoPro cameras that'll allow you to they do time lapse in video. It shoots everything in JPEG, so your quality is going to be a little iffy. It shoots everything in auto exposure, so you don't have a lot of control over it. But it's a nice alternative. It's really small. You can put it anywhere you want, and those things you can attach those to anything. So. And if you do any kind of Google search or look on Amazon, I've seen fun little cameras that you can like plant in your garden and watch your garden grow. I don't know. I'm sure the quality is horrific, but it's probably just a fun way to kind of see how things are growing and changing over time without having to baby it. And lenses, I really prefer to use wide angle lenses. I haven't run into any situation where I wanted a longer lens yet. Because I want to show a really broad, a big scene. I want to see, if I'm doing a cloudscape with the clouds moving in the time lapse, I want to see as much movement in those clouds as possible and capture as much of the sky as I can. And then on the reverse, if I'm shooting down from a building, I want to get as much as I can. So I have a 14 millimeter lens that I like to use for that. I've used a 15 before. That one's kind of fun with the distortion. And I also have played around with using, I have a tilt shift lens. Those are pricey, but I have a 24 tilt shift that I use. I use that for a lot of my landscape too, so it's always in my bag. And if you have a lens baby, those are actually really fun as well. They kind of give things that tilt shift look where it makes things look miniaturized, and of course depending on which optic you have, but those are just some fun options. And of course, with the tilt shift and lens baby, this is an on-one webinar, and I'm actually going to show you when I get into the editing how you can recreate that tilt shift look in your images with a focal point. So you don't have to spend tons of money on a tilt shift, you just have to have focal point. So, okay, other gear, some obvious things you need are, well, you need a tripod. You want to make sure that it's really sturdy and it's not gonna move around in the wind. I actually did a time lapse on the top of the Space Needle at night, and if anyone out there watching saw the little preview or the teaser that I created that kind of just showed a little transition from normal to using focal point, and then at the end there was a night scene. That was so windy up there, and I actually had to just use a small portion of it because the tripod moved a little bit because of the way I have it set up. It's like, basically sitting on top of a ledge, leaning against the grate that they have to keep people from falling off of the Space Needle. And so I was standing there holding it the whole time, and it moved. But for the most part, you're probably not going to, be running into that situation. But you want to make sure that you have a really sturdy tripod and a really great, just make sure it's all not going to move, basically. And it's a good idea to get your horizon as level as possible. You can of course crop it and do things like that when you're editing, but you're going to lose, you're going to lose some of your frame if you're really off on your horizon. So tripods usually have those little bubble things that you can use. I prefer to use. I have a Canon 60D and it has electronic level inside the camera. Absolutely love that thing. So I use that all the time when I'm doing time lapse. Okay, and dollies. Now I kind of talked about these with the camera movement when you're if you want to actually move, have the camera move and have it pan across. That's what these dollies do. They create panning. They can make some. I've never used one actually, but I do actually have one sitting right next to me. I'm demoing one for a company in Berlin, so I get to play with one for about a month and a half just to see how it works. They're really cool, but they're pretty big. It's about 3 feet long for the rail that I have with all the equipment. And I have to carry a small battery around with me. And so, imagine trying to travel overseas with something like this. It's going to be pretty, it's just a lot of equipment, and it's fun to be a photographer, but it's not fun to haul our gear around. It's just one more thing that you'd have to haul around. But locally, or if it's for a really big project, I think it would be worth it. But the other downside is that they're very expensive. They usually range between $800, $1,000, and if those are for, like, I guess the low end ones. And if you wanted to get the high end one like Kessler Crane, I don't even know how much those cost, but it's out of my budget, so I didn't even look into it. But so those are I think you can use them for video too, so they have two purposes. But for the most part, they come with an intervalometer that you can plug right into your camera, and then it just does the whole thing for you. But the cool thing about doing the panning is that you can actually recreate that effect in software. Of course, there are some limitations. You want to have like a really, really wide angle lens and such, and I can kind of briefly touch on that later when I'm talking about editing. I won't really show specifically how to do it. Most people are going to have different software, and to be honest, I'm using Premiere Pro CS4, and while it works well, it's not ideal for a webinar situation because it's just really, really slow and choppy, and I'm sure that it would crash or we'd run into problems. So I'll just kind of give the basics of how to do that. And I'm going to actually go through in these next slides and just kind of show some of my setups of what, sometimes I pull back a little further. This is a little close into the camera. But this is in Times Square. I did a time lapse, and I haven't actually done anything with my New York time lapse things yet. But I did a time lapse, and I just basically plopped down right in the middle of Times Square and got all the people, and people just naturally just walked right around me. So that was kind of cool. You always get funny looks though when you're doing time lapse. You're gonna have to get that, that thick skin of people just kind of staring at you funny, like, what are you doing, just standing there? Your camera's making all sorts of noise. This is in Brooklyn. The clouds were gorgeous. It was sunset, and you can see there were some geese moving, so that's kind of what drew me to that particular scene. This is again on a rooftop up in Brooklyn.
Nicole.
And I use them. Yeah.
Just go back. Again, the slides are advancing pretty slowly. So,
oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Just go back to the Brooklyn with Sheepshead Bay, and then so people can see it.
Okay, so here's Sheepshead Bay. Is that good? All right, and then this was the rooftop in Brooklyn. Has it changed yet? So I use a tilt shift for this one just to, mimic like a diorama, kind of making things look miniature look. Honestly, I actually expect myself to be using focal point a lot more than using the actual tilt in my tilt shift lens, just because I have a lot more control over it. This is in Vietnam, in Hanoi. Very, very, very busy intersection there. That was where I was sitting, was a restaurant, and I wanted to shoot up there, so I just made it my lunchtime. Sorry, scratchy throat right now for some reason. So I just sat there, had lunch, and set up my camera and let it kind of do its thing while I was having lunch. This is a setup. This is again in Vietnam, and we actually did a trek up in Sapa, and I wasn't going to carry my massive tripod and an extra camera because I just wanted to bring minimal gear. I really just walked around with my 5D and my 70 to 200 just on a camera strap around me, and then I just brought my GoPro. So I wanted to do a little bit of time lapse while I was out there, and that was a nice alternative to having to carry all my gear with me. This is in Staten Island. I'm kind of set up here as I would shoot landscape. Time lapse is very similar to landscape photography. You're basically just setting up, finding a really great scene, and then just letting it go. And I don't have a. This is actually a really cool time lapse. If you ever have the opportunity to do any time lapse of an ocean with the waves coming in it, it makes it look pretty neat. You know, especially in this one. I wish I had this one finished. I could show you guys, but because I have waves moving and then I have the clouds moving at the same time, so I found a lot of movement in this scene. This is the same spot. It's just showing my camera facing a different direction. This is a basic setup for me. That's my travel tripod. I have a 60D. One thing I like about it is it has that articulating screen, so I can set my camera in different spots. I can put it really down way low or up high, and I can always preview my shot when I'm without having to like get way down and look at the back of the screen. And this is actually where I broke my intervalometer too. There are all these little cracks in the concrete there, and there was some water filled in one of them, and it fell right into one of them. So another spot here. This was what bridge was this? Williamsburg Bridge, I think, in New York. Is that right, Brian?
Yeah, it's the Williamsburg Bridge.
I used a 15 fisheye for this. Gave it a really cool effect, and just a lot of people walking. And I just kind of got, you always want to kind of try and get an out of the way spot so people don't bump into you because you don't want to have to move your camera in the middle of a time lapse. And this is my rooftop. I'm actually going to
Nicole?
show this time. Yes.
Just a few quick things. Can you
Sure.
tell people what filter you used? You don't have to go back to the image, but that the
Oh
soft
yeah.
grad.
I
And
was
then
using.
just talk about
Yeah, I
your
had a. You go.
the filter, the tripod, and the ball head.
Okay. Well, some of these I'm using a different tripod, so I'll tell you both of my different tripods. My travel tripod is a Gitzo travel tripod. It's a teensy tiny little light tripod. It's fairly expensive, but it's great if you do any kind of travel. And so that's the little one you saw when it was sitting on that ledge where I dunked my intervalometer in the water. The other tripod I have is an Enduro CT14 or something like that. I don't remember the exact number. And that one, I like that one a whole lot. It's got a nice little padded thing on it, so my hands don't freeze when I'm carrying it around. It's a pretty good tripod. I use Really Right Stuff tripod head, and then I actually have just a simple, I need to get I want to get the bracket for my 60. I don't have it yet, but I'm just using a Really Right Stuff head with a screw-on tripod plate right now. So, and then the filter I used was, I was using the Lee. The filter wasn't a Lee. The filter is a Stingray. Is that right? Is that how you pronounce it? It's just a neutral density grad filter. I don't remember the stops on it. And I have a Lee. What's that called? The Lee holder.
It's the
Can't
Lee
remember
Big
what it's
Stopper.
called. No, I wasn't using the big stopper for that one. Just with the thing that holds it.
Oh, the foundation kit.
Yes, the foundation kit. Thanks, Brian. So that's I use that one. I only have the setup. Well, actually, I lie. I actually have it for my other lens now, but I usually just use that Lee foundation setup when I have my tilt shift lens on, and I oftentimes don't even use the tilt shift lens with any funky focus. I just use it to as a nice 24 mil, and I can kind of correct the distortion and things when I'm photographing. This setup here, I have the 14 millimeter lens on it. This is actually my rooftop in my apartment building, so I have a pretty good view of the Space Needle. And this is right. I think this was right before that. It snowed, but it was right before it got really bad in Seattle, just like last month, I think. And it was kind of interesting. I don't. I just moved here, so and I heard from people you don't really see snow a whole lot, so I thought I'd actually do a little time lapse of the snow. And the clouds were kind of moving too, so um, and you'll see this time lapse and as I when I share how to do the perfect effects and batching perfect effects through Lightroom. And this was Rockefeller Center. A lot of people moving. I think I set this to I dragged the shutter a little bit on this one. And this is just kind of how where I was set up. If you try to set up a tripod in these areas, the security guys walk over to you and immediately tell you to move. And I think I was sneaky enough with my little tiny tripod right next to that post where no one noticed me. And I intentionally was next to that post because I didn't want people to, there was a lot of people there. It was Christmas time, and I didn't want people to run into me and knock into my tripod. So I was kind of protecting it with that and then with myself. And I ended up being the photographer. People walk up and ask, they see you with a camera, so they ask you to take their picture. So I did my photographic, civic duty as well. And this is on top of the Space Needle. This is what I was saying, how I have when I mentioned the tripod issue with my camera getting blown around and having to hold on to it. This is basically the same spot. It was, of course, just at night when it was a little bit more windy and, of course, darker. But this, I used a 14 for this. That's my Enduro tripod, same ball head and everything. You'll see this video. I'll show this one later, so you guys will get to see this one. Okay, now I'm going to jump into camera settings. Okay, basic settings that you want to set with your camera. You want to shoot, I shoot in manual mode. That's what I prefer. I like the exposure to stay consistent, so that way if there are changes in the sky, or let's say you're shooting when it's going to get darker, I just kind of like it to just fade to dark. So that's my preference. I haven't done a lot, I'll be honest, I haven't done a lot of sunrises and sunsets with time-lapse, so I haven't really gotten into that too much. Another thing you can do, and this is good for photographing people or anything that moves. You don't have to do this. I kind of go back and forth. Sometimes I do this, sometimes I don't. But it adds a nice, much smoother effect if you drag your shutter. And when I say that, I mean a longer shutter speed. So, something more like 1/5 of a second, 1/15 of a second, something where it's just going to allow for a little bit of blur in whatever's moving. And it can also help to reduce the flicker in a time lapse. If anyone has ever experienced that, and I think that one of my videos that I'm sharing has a little bit of that, where sometimes if you have a lot of clouds, then the exposure changes a little bit, or your exposure doesn't change, but the light changes in your scene, so it makes things look like they're flickering because they're getting darker and brighter. But sometimes dragging the shutter can help with that. So. And another thing you can try, which I haven't really used yet, but it is an option, is bulb ramping. And what that does is you can do this with things like the Magic Lantern software that I mentioned, is it compensates for the sun setting or the sun rising, and it changes your exposure based on that. So it kind of keeps up with the sunset, so it doesn't just fade to dark. It kind of, like if you wanted to do, let's say I was on top of the Space Needle, and I wanted to shoot the sunset. I wanted to shoot it during the day while right before the sun sets, and I wanted to stay there with all the lights of the city getting, blossoming and becoming beautiful. I would probably use bulb ramping, because I would want it to flow from, I would still want it to look like it's getting dark, but I want it to, I still want to be able to see those lights in the city instead of it just being too dark to see anything. So that's when you would use something like bulb ramping.
Hey, Nicole?
Yes.
Can you just talk a little bit more about dragging the shutter? There are a few questions that are coming in about that.
Yeah, what were the other questions specific to anything in particular?
So, what do you usually do to drag the shutter and for what reason?
Well, the reason you would want to drag okay, so let's say you're doing a lot of let's say you're photographing down on a bunch of people, like with that intersection I had, if you remember the behind the scenes of the one in Vietnam. I don't think I dragged the shutter on that. So because I didn't drag the shutter, when I photographed it, the people were still. Let's. I'm just gonna guess. I used one 2/50th of a second. So it was a pretty fast shutter speed. Total guessing here. But if you photograph something like that, you're gonna freeze the person in the frame. So they're just gonna be, they're not gonna be moving. They're just gonna be standing there. But if you drag the shutter and you extend that shutter, the shutter stays open for longer, then the person is going to walk while the shutter is open, which is going to blur them a little bit. So that way, when you piece all of these still pictures of these people who are blurred just a little bit moving, then it creates this kind of feel of all this blur of people in the time lapse. It's kind of hard to explain. Do you think that is, did that answer the question?
Yeah, I mean, I basically explained it that dragging the shutter. I mean, it's not just for time lapse; it's for anything where
Yeah,
you drop you let the shutter go a little bit longer so that you capture a little bit of the movement or the motion.
yeah,
And
exactly. In the case of reducing flicker, which is what some people use it for, um, that's just because capturing more you're capturing a longer period of time in the scene. So if you have a cloudy scene, not cloud, but like poofy, beautiful clouds in the sky that are every once in a while going over the sun or under the sun, so that way, it shades the scene a little bit. If your shutter is dragging enough to where it's not, the sun isn't covered the whole time, you're getting a little bit of light and a little bit of shade, then it kind of balances out and you're not getting that flickering. And like I said, when I share one of the videos, I'll explain that you'll see a little bit of the flickering in this video, and that's just, I don't think I dragged the shutter too much. It wasn't a super fast shutter speed, but because of the way the scene was and the clouds in the sky, it just added a little bit of that. So yeah. All right, I'm going to move on to the setting for your lens, and it's pretty simple. You just want to make sure that you manually focus your lens so that way it's not trying to refocus every single time it creates a photograph. Okay, now on to the settings for your file type. In your camera, you have, of course, two options. You have RAW and JPEG. And you can do both, and I'll kind of explain, the pros and cons with both of them. Okay, so if you want to shoot with RAW, if you shoot RAW to begin with, you already understand the benefits. You retain full control over your edits. You can go back and change your white balance, and you're not going to destroy your pixels as much when you're editing. You just have a little bit more control over those edits in your RAW software. I'm going to be showing you how to do that in Lightroom. But the downside is they're very large files, and depending on your card size, your compact flash or your SD card, you probably won't be able to fit 600 or so frames in one card with RAW, unless you have like a really really large card. But if you want to shoot more than one time lapse, you'd have to have several cards. So some of the alternatives are to use SRAW, which stands for small RAW, or medium RAW, to create smaller RAW files. And I don't think all cameras have this, but a lot of the newer ones do. I know my 6DD does, and I use this almost all the time. I think I just go down to SRAW. I don't think I need to go any bigger than that. And I'll explain that. There's a slide I have after this that kind of shows why you could use SRAW or MRAW to actually, get the proper size for these videos, because you don't need a 5,000 wide image to create a video that's only going to be, almost like 1920 or whatever, pixels wide. So, like I said, just said, the large file sizes are unnecessary for HD video. But if you want to create the software panning, then you might want to shoot in RAW because then you have much more of the frame that you can actually pan across. So that's the exception to shooting with a smaller file size like SRAW or MRAW. Now, if you wanted to shoot with JPEG, you can still do that. I used to do that when I didn't have SRAW or MRAW. You, of course, get smaller file sizes, which is a good thing for card space, but you get a lot of image compression. You know, your quality is going to go down if you do a lot of editing after the fact. You want to make sure you get your white balance, everything in camera that you can possibly get. You want to try and get if you're going to shoot with JPEG. Now, card sizes these days, with my 60D, it takes SD cards, and I bought 30. I think I got two 32 gig cards for like $40 each. Or they're really really good price. So those are my time-lapse cards. Actually, my 60D is my dedicated time-lapse camera. I don't use it for anything else. So I have SD cards for that, and they're really really large. I can fit several time lapses on both of those cards. So I'm usually pretty good if I'm going to go out and do a lot of shooting without being able to actually put them on my camera afterward. I'm on my computer afterwards. But if I ran into a problem, I would probably switch down to JPEG. Okay, now this is just a graphic showing, like I'll just use mine now. The Canon 60D, just so you're aware, is a crop camera, and it's 18 megapixels, I think. So, so I have a pixel size of a little over 5,000 by almost 3,500 pixels in size. But when you are gonna, if you want to create a time lapse and export it as 1080p, which is 1920 pixels by 1080 pixels, that is a cutout of the amount of pixels that you actually need to create that that video. So you can see here that a full RAW size is way way bigger than you need. If you shot in SRAW with a Canon 60D at least, I would get about 100 or 200 pixels over the size that I need for a 1080p video, which still gives me a little bit of wiggle room for cropping. So that's why a lot of the time I shoot with SRAW. If I know I'm just going to do a straight, I'm not going to do any kind of panning or anything, and I'll shoot it with SRAW. And then if you're going to do, if you know you want to export it as 720p, which is a smaller HD video, then it's even a smaller portion of that RAW file. So this is just kind of a graphic to show you don't need to use the entire RAW file or even JPEG size of your image that comes out of camera at the full res. Okay, now getting into the fun stuff. I'm just going to briefly go over editing the images. I'm going to get into the editing and actually demonstrate how to do this after the fact, but I want to kind of talk about it first. Okay, so editing still images. I use Lightroom. I love Lightroom, and I don't use Aperture, but I assume that you can do the same things in Aperture you can in Lightroom. So Lightroom is great. It catalogs the images. You can organize them really well, and it's very easy to edit your images and then sync them all together. Now you can do this in Photoshop and through Bridge and Camera Raw, and it's real similar. But I like Lightroom. And if you don't have Lightroom, I highly recommend it. They have Lightroom 4 beta is out. You can download it for free and try it out until the new one comes out. But it just makes things so much easier for time lapse, especially with the organizing. It's just great. You can also export to the proper sizes using this real simply, and I'm going to show that. Or you can add presets, and I'll show that with the On1 Perfect Effects and Focal Point. And like I said, other options, you could use Aperture or Bridge. And On1 software, as I've already mentioned several times, you can add blur, tilt shift, or any kind of blur really that you want to add. And you can also add effects. and which is a lot cooler than when I first started playing with it. It's a lot more neat than I expected it to be. So I really like this, and I'll be using these a lot. And yeah, it's just really exciting. It's fun to play around with these things. Okay, so actually creating the time-lapse video. This is after you already have all of your still images edited and exported, and they look exactly how you want them to look, and they're all sitting in a folder. Now you want to actually create the file, the movie file, that just the clip of that time lapse. And there are actually several different ways you can do this. If you have Photoshop, and I should have wrote extended on here, you have to have Photoshop extended if you want to do it in Photoshop. And it costs a little bit more, but it allows you to edit things like video, and of course you can do 3D and stuff, but that's kind of beyond the scope of this course. But Photoshop extended and Lightroom, you can download presets. I'll show how to do both of these things in this isn't how I normally do it. I usually use QuickTime 7, and I think it might just be a Mac thing, and it's an older version of QuickTime, so that's why I'm showing you the other versions, because it's not like you can just go and download it and it's easy to download. But if you have it, I actually like it. I just think it's a simpler process than the other two. And if you have anything like Premiere Pro or Final Cut, there are ways to do it in those programs as well. I'm not going to get into those, but those are video programs. They're very advanced, and you can get into a lot of editing that way. So that's another option for you. Now, after you have all of your time-lapse videos created, you have all these movie files and these individual images, more than likely you're going to want to put them together into some kind of video and share them and put them to music. Now, something that I really want, I added a special slide for this because it's understanding, copyright and licensing and stuff is very near and dear to my heart, especially as a photographer, and it's no different with music. So if you want to use music in your in your time lapse, you need to make sure that you can legally use that music and then it's properly licensed. Now, I usually just buy or license the music. I pay for it. I'm a stock photographer with iStock Photo, and they also have an audio section, and I've found most of my music for my videos through iStock Photo. I'm usually just looking for instrumentals, and I know that if I license it through iStock, then I'm in the clear, and I don't have to worry about who owns the file, and if it's not, if it's properly licensed, I know I'm good to go. Of course, I read everything. I look at the license. I make sure that what I'm downloading is good to go. But I'm almost, so I almost always go through iStock. The files cost, the ones that I get, it depends on the complexity of the file, but I usually pay about $25. It's like, I think 25 credits for the more complex files. But and I think it's worth it. It's good music. It's going to an artist, and I just want to make sure that my music is good to go. And I come up with some pretty fun videos, so I don't mind paying a few dollars. There are, of course, other routes that you can go. There are Creative Commons, and you oftentimes can find music that you can use for free. With some attribution, you might have to put their name in the video somewhere to say that the music was by, so and so, or make sure that they're credited. But like I said, read everything about the license to that file before you use it. I put a link in here, creativecommons.org/legal music for videos. This is a good place that links to other sites where you can find music that you can use in anything. But oftentimes this kind of stuff is for non-commercial purposes, which is that's what I use it for. I don't do time-lapse for other businesses or clients. I just do this for myself, which is, I'm guessing, what most of the people watching this webinar want to do. They want to create these videos for themselves so they can just share. And so oftentimes you can use Creative Commons music for those purposes. Another really cool site, it has a limited selection, but it's a site that Moby put together, and it's called mobygratis.com. And that is, I believe, free to use non-commercially, and there's some real interesting stuff in there. And so you check that one out and download some, some of those to use in your time lapse if you want to. But all in all, whatever you do, even if it's like I said with iStock, whatever, make sure you read the fine print, because every license is different. Some of them might say it's free, but then you read the fine print and you find out it's only free to play and listen in your own home for your own pleasure. But if you want to put it on YouTube or anywhere else, you have to pay, or you have to do this, you have to do that. So just make sure that whatever you do, you read the fine print. Okay, so I'm about ready to get into the actual editing part here of the webinar. And I'm just going to go through, I'm going to kind of share with you the steps that I actually go through first, and then I'm going to jump in and actually start doing them. The very first thing I do is, of course, after shooting them, I've got all my time lapses created. I edit and sync them in Lightroom. So Lightroom is my very first step. And then after they're all completely edited in Lightroom, I export them to a folder. And at this time, if I wanted to add any on-one presets, I would add them at this time. So they would export and then apply all of the presets at the same time. Then I take all of those images from that folder and I create the time-lapse sequence, or just the single file of just that time-lapse. And I use QuickTime. I'll show QuickTime, I'll show Lightroom, and I'll also show Photoshop for those who don't have QuickTime. And then the part I'm not really going to show, but I just wanted to include it in here, is where I will take all of those files and then I do my own fancy editing in Premiere Pro, and I put them to music and spend several hours creating this elaborate time-lapse video synced to music. So that is the end of my keynote, my slideshow. Are there any questions before I jump into the actual editing?
Questions around the editing, which I think you'll go over now. So.
Okay. Well, just feel free to stop me when I'm in the middle of it, because I don't want to jump ahead too far and then have to backtrack for somebody. So just feel free to interrupt as you need to. Okay, so the first one I'm going to share is just real simple. Well, let me hide this real quickly. It's driving me crazy. Sorry, this application is bouncing. All right, we're good. Okay, the first thing I'm going to share is just basic editing. Let's kind of zoom in here so you can see the file. This is on a rooftop in Brooklyn. I used a 15mm lens with this, so I have a little distortion. And the clouds were crazy. They were beautiful. They were moving. It was so windy that day. So I'm going to just kind of share how I edit this file. So I'm in the library mode. I was just viewing the grid view. I have 600 frames for this. I think I shot them every 2 seconds. Just kind of going by my standard operation. That's usually what I end up doing when I'm doing clouds and stuff like that. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump over to the develop module. It doesn't really matter which one I pick. Let me go back to the grid view real quickly. If I scroll through to the end, I'm just going to jump all the way to the end. You can see that the, oh man, it jumped back. There we go. It got darker. Of course, the sun was starting to set. So I don't want to edit anything here because I know it's going to get darker. So if I go all the way back up to the top, this is when it was brighter. I want to make sure I'm editing. It doesn't really matter. I'll just start with the first one just for good measure. And I just want to make sure that this section of images is edited properly, and then it'll eventually just kind of fade to dark as it gets to the end because the light will change in the scene. I'm jump back to the develop module. Now, the first thing I always do when I'm doing time-lapse is I crop it to the proper aspect ratio. So I use the crop tool over here. Now, I already have some, I don't want to just kind of guess my crop. I wouldn't want that on. I don't want to just guess. I want to actually enter in a custom one. And the ratio you use when you are doing HD video is 16:9. So I have it here, but I'm going to go ahead and show you how to enter a custom. Just sorry, I'll do that one more time a little bit more slowly. Just go on to enter custom. And then here you would just type 16:9 and then just click OK. And so this right here is my ratio that I want to use. I'm just going to slide it all the way to the bottom to make sure I get all of that city scene in there. And then I'm going to click return. And now everything I do from now on, I want to make sure that I'm doing global adjustments, meaning that I'm going to change things to the entire image. I like to add like gradients and stuff, so I'm going to start with a gradient. And I'll just make sure that it's a little darker, and you can change it after the fact. So I'll start really extreme just so you can see the effect. And drag down. And if I hold the shift key while I'm dragging down, then it keeps it straight. Now that is obviously way too much, so I'm going to bring it back up. And we'll see what that looked like before and after, and that's pretty good. And now I shot these raw so I can edit my white balance without really, affecting anything. So I'm just gonna do that kind of quickly here and pull out some of that yellow. But when I pull out the yellow, I notice that the sky kind of gets a little dingy. So I'm actually gonna go back to that gradient. I'm gonna click on it there in the middle to make sure it's active. I'm gonna add a little bit of a color to it. I'm just gonna click this yellow. I for some reason have a yellow up there, so I'm gonna click yellow. And then, oops, I'm going to go back here. I'm going to bring that opacity down a little bit. So I just basically added that yellow back to the sky that I liked. It's very subtle. It's all about subtlety. I don't like to do massive, crazy changes to make my images look nuclear or anything like that. All right, I'm just going to try an auto tone to see what that does. It made it a little too dark, so I'm just going to bring it back up. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of go with this. I'm not going to get too crazy with my editing, and I'm going to just jump into showing you guys how to sync these. So I'm going to go back into to grid view just so we can see all of the images. I'm going to make it a little bit smaller. So as you can see, I've edited this one up here, but all the rest of them are still exactly the same. So I want to highlight this image, go all the way down to the bottom, and let me unhide that side there. And now I want to sync settings. I want to make sure that every single thing in here is checked because I made global adjustments to the image. I need every single image in this time lapse to look exactly the same. So I have them all checked. I'm going to click synchronize. And this will take a second. Previews will have to rebuild. You don't really have to wait for them to rebuild. But there we go. They're starting to kind of move there. So that's all I have to do in Lightroom. I'm pretty much done with this. And now I'm going to export it. So again, I'm going to select them all. I'm going to export. And I already have, I created some time-lapse exports over here. I'm not going to, I don't know if I can reset, but I'm not really going to use that right now because I'm going to show you guys how to do it. And then I'll show you how to create the preset for just a basic export straight out of Lightroom. So I'm not actually going to export these because it'll take forever for them to actually export like 600 files. So I'm just going to leave this however, desktop. I usually export them to my desktop and then I move them if I need to. Because if I'm going to another external hard drive, it usually takes forever to export them. So I'll usually just export them to the the main disk drive and then make the video out of that. But so I'm just going to leave this. I'm just going to forget about that for now. You can change your naming to whatever. I usually just keep it the same so that way it's either in sequence or it has the original file number because I want to make sure that they all stay in the same order. I always export as JPEG and sRGB because sRGB is good for web, for a profile for the web, and these go on the web. So I usually just stick with that. And this is where you want to kind of make your changes right here. If you want to make a 1080p video, then you want to set the short edge to 1080. And then you can just set your resolution to 72. You're not going to print it, so 72 is a good number for the web, for exporting to the web. So 1080p for your short edge. If you wanted to make it a smaller HD, it's a 720, then you would just change this to 720. And that's all that's doing is just resizing this shorter edge to 720, so that the longer edge is 1280, and then of course the other way for the 1080 and 1920. And sometimes I'll just usually sharpen for screen just to make sure it's nice and crisp. I don't worry about any of these other things. I don't want to add a watermark. You could, if you wanted to watermark your time lapse, this actually would be a good option because it would add it to every single frame. So that is an option there, but I don't like to watermark mine. I don't worry about the metadata. So that is set how I want it. Now, in order to create the preset for this, I'd have it all set the way I want. Usually, if you're going to create a preset, though, for any preset, you sometimes will want to do the choose folder later. That way, you don't have to decide that when you're exporting it. Then, as soon as you click the export button, it pops up and it asks you which folder you want to export your images to. So that's usually a good option for presets. You just click Add over here, title it. I'll just title this one 720p, and I'll just put it in my time-lapse folder. I'll just put it 720p2 because I already have one in there, and then create. So now I have a 720p. It's probably real similar to my other 720p one, but that's how you create presets and would export. Normally I would click export, but I'm not going to because I don't want you guys to have to sit here for 20 minutes while it exports. I actually have these files already edited, so I'll show you how to create the time-lapse video file of this exact time-lapse set. So I'm just going to hit cancel. And so that was creating, editing, everything for just a straight time-lapse without any stylization or focal point or anything to it. The next one I'm going to share is how to, oh, I'm sorry, Brian, if you want to actually go ahead and, no, okay, never mind, let's wait. I was going to ask you to share the link, but we'll wait until I actually start creating the video files, and then you can share them then, if you're okay with that. Were there any questions about, what were you going to say, Brian?
I'm fine with that.
Okay. All right, so just to kind of catch everyone up on what I'm doing, I'm going to show how to edit all of these, and then we're going to go into create the time-lapse videos, and that's when we'll share the links and play the video so you guys can actually see the final creation of these. Okay, so Space Needle. This is the time-lapse I'm going to show how to use on-one perfect effects to stylize an image. Now, I'm showing all of my files here. I don't think I had any intro files on the other one. But these top files right up here are the images that I used in setting up my shot. So I was doing some tests. So starting over here on the left, I'm going to increase the size here. I was doing test shots over here. It was too dark. So I finally, I got my frame that I wanted. And then I just put my hand in front of it, and I just, I'll stick my hand out there, I'll do a thumbs up, I'll do whatever. That's just telling me that the very next frame is the start of my time lapse. So that's what that's all about. So I'm going to go ahead and just start with this one. I'm going to go into my develop module, and I'm just going to do basically the same things that I did before. I'm going to crop. I can use that 16:9 aspect ratio because I created the custom one, so I drop right down to that. And then I just move it where I want. I don't want to cut off the Space Needle, so I'll stop it about right there. Click OK. And I'm really just going to do some very simple, minimal editing to this. I don't want to get too crazy and take too much time because I want to get to the juicy stuff. Okay, so I'm just going to keep it like that. I'm not going to get too insane. Okay, so now I want to create, I want to export this with an effect, with an on-one effect. But I don't know which one I want to use yet. And actually, I might want to create my own preset. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to export one frame of this. And for those of you who know how to use Lightroom, you know that I could just do, I could just do edit in Photoshop, and I could, or I'm sorry, edit it. I could edit it straight out of here in ON1 software, and in any normal still photograph, I would do that. But because I don't want to interrupt my sequence of my images, I don't want to add any frames into this, I'm not going to do that. So I'm just going to export one file, and that's just going to be my file that I use to create my effect. I'll end up deleting that file, and then I'll export all the images with that preset that I've created. So I already actually have this set up to export a JPEG at I'll just do 720p because that's a smaller size. It'll work better with the webinar, and it's just going to go straight to my desktop. So I'm going to click export. Okay, let me hide that. And I'm going to go ahead and open up ON1. Should have had this open before, huh? Are there any questions while we're waiting?
Fielding most of them. I think you're good to go.
Okay. Okay, so I have Perfect Photo Suite open. I'm just going to take the file from my desktop and just drag it into the screen so it pops open. Okay, so I want to go straight into effects. And just to kind of, just so everyone's aware, if you want to add an effect or anything, any focal point, anything to your image for a time lapse, I highly recommend that at the very least you have your image cropped first, because if you don't crop it first and then you do your preset and then you go in and you export all of them, and it might look different because of the aspect ratio, because it is a different aspect ratio than the original file. So it's always a good idea to at least crop your image first. Okay, so here I am in Perfect Effects, and this is where you get to have a lot of fun in actually creating your preset. I have some presets that I've made. They're just real basic presets. I call them my instant film presets, and I can't remember what I used for the demo you're going to see. But so I'm just going to kind of have fun with this one and edit it however I want to, and then the demo is going to look a little different when you actually see the final one. But I'm just clicking on the preset that I want, and it pops up right here. I didn't have to do anything for that first layer. I just added a preset, and it just applied to it. If I want to change it, I just click on it. I still have that layer active, so it's changing. It's not adding to anything. It's just changing the original one. I'm actually going to go into landscape and just kind of play with some of these. So we could add another blizzard to it. Probably wouldn't want to do that. That didn't look so good. So we'll try golden hour enhancer for this one. Okay, so let's say I have the colors. I have this effect that I want finished and everything. What I want to do now is I want to add a texture to it. So, or if you want to add a texture, if you want to add anything else to it, you have to add a layer. So I just click add, and after I click that add, all of the preview thumbnails repopulate. So now it's showing me what things look like down here with this new with the new filter added. So I'm gonna actually go into textures. I love adding textures to my images, and it actually makes a pretty cool effect with time lapse. And I'm just going to find a fun, I think recycled. I think this is the one I used for the demo. So I'll go with that one. So I kind of make it, so we've gone from just like a real bluish, simple, snowy scene to kind of like a papery vintage look here. Okay, so I have this how I want it. Now I want to save my preset. So I go up to presets, save presets, and I'm just actually going to call this vintage paper. And I have a folder called Lightroom presets that I use. So I'm just going to do that, and I'll say that I created it, and I'll click create. And why not? I'll just apply that. I don't have to save it, but I'm going to. And no, we won't save it actually. I'm just going to close it. I don't need to save it. It'll take too long. And I'm going to quit out of on one. I'm going to go back into Lightroom, back into my grid mode. Now I want to select all of these images. So I have all those photos selected that I've previously edited. I'm going to go to export, and in order to use the on1 export to export with presets, you need to go up to the export to and then select on1 perfect effects. The very first thing you set is the preset. It always resets whenever you go to this. So it always starts over. You'll see black and white, Adele with frame. So I go down to my Lightroom presets and I select vintage paper because that's the one that I just created. And I'm going to choose, I don't want it in the same folder. I'm going to, I'll just, I'm not going to export these because this will take forever to export in the webinar. So I'm just going to say vintage, I'm just going to do this for good measure, vintage space needle. And I don't need to rename, you can if you want to. Now this is an important part right here. You want to export these as PSDs. There may be other options, but don't export them as JPEG. If you export them as JPEG, every single time the on1 software processes the image, it's going to pop up. It's not a bad thing. It's just not a good thing for doing a huge batch of images. But every single time it processes the JPEG, it's going to open up and say what file, like what quality do you want to save this as? And that's not a bad thing normally, but when you have 600 photos that you want to export, you don't want to have to sit and baby your computer for 600 files. So if you export them as a PSD, a Photoshop document, it doesn't ask you that. So you don't have to worry about it. So always export these as PSDs. I'm guessing it probably does the same thing with TIFF, but I'm not 100%. So I always just default to PSD. Image sizing, I don't want it to be 300. It always defaults to 300 with this, so I'm just going to change it to 72. And again, sharpening, I'm just going to keep it on screen. Don't change the metadata, no need to. And then I'm not going to add a watermark. So, yeah.
For the image sizing, were you outputting this to 1080 or 720?
This was a 720.
Okay, I just was, yep.
720.
Sounds good.
So I mean, I could have done this entire process, and at 1080, and it would be there would be really very little change. I'm just doing it at 720 because it's if I'm just going to put something on the web, oftentimes I'll do it at 720 unless it's like a really big production video that I want to look great, like on a TV screen. Then I'll do 1080. But these demonstrations, I'm just doing 720. These will be perfect if you're just going to view things on the web. So. Okay, where was I? Okay, so I have everything set up here, and I normally would click export. I'm not going to do that now. Now, one thing about exporting with batching a time lapse with perfect effects is it takes a pretty long time for this to work. There's a lot of processes it has to go through, and of course, depending on your effect that you added, it has to apply all of those things individually to each image. So literally could be sitting there for an hour, hour and a half. It's one of those things that if you know you're going to do it like right before you're going to go cook dinner and then just let it run and then come back to it and then check your files and make sure everything's good to go. Because when it's running, it kind of takes over your computer. So it's worth it. It's definitely worth it because you get some really cool effects. And basically what it does is it exports all of the files. If I'm correct me if I'm wrong, Brian, but I believe it exports all of the files to the folder you specify from Lightroom, and then after all of those files are exported as PSDs, the on1 software does its thing to each individual file. So it's not like it exports one, applies the effect, and then it's finished. It does it all like in sections. So it exports all of the PSDs. After the PSDs are exported from Lightroom, on1 takes over and adds all the effects to each image. All right, so that is how you create and we'll get into the continuation of this in a second here. I am going to actually go back and show you. Let me. This right here is my. These are the files that I created earlier. So this is the all the JPEGs from the Brooklyn rooftop one that I shared. And this is the effects file. The effect is a little different than the one I just shared, but so it just exports them all to a folder as PSDs. So there's that. And now I'm going to just real quickly do a focal point before I get into the actual video creation of these files. Okay, so again, we're in Seattle, having a lot of fun on the Space Needle, and I have my test shots beforehand. So this is telling me that this one right here is the first one that I want to edit. So I'm going to bring that into the develop module and do some quick edits. This is one of those things that it's even more important. You want to make sure that you do your cropping before you create the preset in focal point, because you need to make sure that the spot you want in focus is going to be the same when it exports as a preset. Otherwise, it'll just add it like smack dab in the middle or wherever it thinks it should be. So I'm going to crop it. I'll just do real quick adjustments here so I can get into the focal point. I'm going to check my clipping and recover some of that. Probably won't be able to recover all of it. And just real quick editing here. Oops, didn't want to do that. Okay, so but I also want to add a nice gradient to the top here because I'm losing some of those clouds. So same as before, I'll just drag down, hold the shift key, and then I'm going to bring that back so it's a little bit darker. And let's check the before and after. I did a lot to this. Oh, it's hard to check because I've been doing all sorts of things with this today. So, okay, so here's my file. I'm just going to work on this one. I'm going to bring it into focal point, but I'm going to do it the same way I did before. I'm going to export one file as 720p. I'll just go straight to the desktop. Make sure everything else is good. Okay, so I'll just export that one file. And did I still have, oh, I closed on one, didn't I? Why did I do that? No, that didn't take long. Okay, so here's my Space Needle shot. I'm just going to bring it into On1 software. Okay, and I want to go straight into blur. Focal point equals blur. So I'm going to go ahead and reset all because it's kind of already set the way I want it because I was testing this out earlier and had to create my demo shot. So what I just did there was I went to edit, reset all. It's always a good idea. It's recommended that you reset your scene in focal point so you're starting from scratch and you're not repeating things over and over and over. And every scene is different too, so you don't want to repeat things over and over. Okay, so I want to go for a tilty, shifty look on this. So I'm going to change the shape from round to planar, or planner, however you pronounce that. And I'm going to take this little handle right here on the focus bug and angle it, or sorry, move it down. You could go straight. I'm going to go a little sideways. And I actually want my main point of focus to be this crane right here. Because when you watch the time lapse, that's one of the things that always catches my eye when I'm staring at it. And this already actually started out pretty good. The amount of blur is a little heavy-handed for my taste, so I'm gonna bring that amount down a little bit. Oh, you know what I forgot to do? I forgot to add my tilt effect. If you want to add a tilt effect to your image in focal point, hold the Option or Alt key down and click, and then drag down. And you can see how it's kind of changing that the plane of focus a little bit. So there, that almost missed that crucial step. I might just play with the feather a tiny little bit, but I think I've got it pretty good. And you can add some of the other effects down here. You have like brightness and contrast. And oftentimes in tilt shift diorama kind of things, you see a lot more contrast in the scenes than with normal. But that's a good start. That's a good. I'm happy with that. So I'm going to save this as a preset, and you do that in focal point down here. I don't know if you can do it up in the top part. I always just do it from down here in the presets panel. Click on this little plus icon, and I'm going to call this Seattle Tilty Shifty. I'm going to put it in my own Tilty Shifty category and create. So now I have my Seattle Tilty Shifty preset down there. I can apply it, I don't really have to. And I'm just going to close this. I don't need to save it. And I don't think I'm going to come back on one, so I'm just going to quit. Go back into Lightroom. Now I'm going to go back to grid view, and just like before, I'm going to select all the, oops, I don't want that last one, I messed up there. Select all of my images that I want to export. I'm going to go into export. And same as last time, we go to export to focal point this time. And now you want to make sure you set the preset. I'm going to find that tilty shifty category, find the one I just created. I would choose, I'd probably put this on the desktop somewhere. And file naming doesn't have to change. These you can export as JPEGs. This is different than Perfect Effects. You export these as JPEGs, they'll be just fine. If you export with focal point, it goes a lot quicker than with Perfect Effects, just so you're aware of that. So you can keep this as a JPEG and it'll work wonderfully. This doesn't need to change, and everything else is good. So I would then click export, and it would export all of these with a nice tilt shift look without actually having to use an expensive tilt shift camera. I'm going to click cancel because I don't really want to sit here for several minutes while that's doing its thing. I'm going to go ahead and hide Lightroom because I'm pretty much done in Lightroom. I'll get back to it in a second when I show how to create the movie from Lightroom. Okay, so now I'm actually going to get into creating the video file. I have a whole bunch of time lapses here. I'm going to show, let's see, I'll show these three. So I'll start off with the Brooklyn one, that first one that we saw. I'm going to go through, with this one I'll just show the basic QuickTime way of exporting a file. So I have QuickTime Player 7, and like I said, this is something that not everyone's going to be able to get. I think it depends on your operating system. It depends on whether you have Mac or PC. But I like it, and I really, really hope that Apple one day or QuickTime brings it back. Because if you have the newest QuickTime Player, I think it's 10. For some reason, they removed this feature from it. So very frustrating, but I guess that's Apple, right? Okay, so I have QuickTime Player open, and I'm going to, oh, now I don't have it open. Now I have it open. I'm going to go to File, Open Image Sequence, and now I just navigate to, that was in Time-lapse sequence files. I navigate to the folder. I only need to click on one image. I click Open. I choose my frame rate, and I'm just going to go with 23,976. It's real similar to 24. So that's, I believe, I don't know, I'll be honest, I'm not a video person, so I know kind of what I need to know when it comes to video, but 23,976 is the frame rate that I use when I'm creating my time lapses. And I click OK. And it'll work for a minute, hopefully not a minute, but for a few seconds.
Up in there really quickly, Sean from buddy who's a Lightroom aficionado, brought up a good point about QuickTime 7, that this feature is actually a QuickTime 7 Pro feature. It's not the basic.
Yes.
So
Thank you for mentioning that. Yeah, I failed to mention that. It is a QuickTime Pro feature. If you can have access and can download QuickTime Pro, QuickTime 7 Pro, it's only like $30. So it's really inexpensive. Okay. So I don't know if this is even doing anything in the scene, but this is the video. I'm just going to pause it because it's usually pretty choppy when it first pops up. This is the video file. It goes, it moves, and then it kind of fades to dark a little bit. And if I would just go to I just go to File, Save, and save this as a video, and I'd be done with that. And this actually would be a good time, Brian, to share and insert the Brooklyn time-lapse link that I sent to you. So, but when you guys are watching this video, you'll see a little bit of that flickering that I mentioned. It's mostly due to the clouds covering up and going. There are a lot of puffy clouds in this, and a lot of them are covering up the sun. So it's kind of making the whole scene look like it's flickering a little bit. So that was the flickering that I mentioned earlier. Very windy day, really gorgeous day for a time lapse, just because of the direction of the clouds and the way they were moving. I'm going to close that. I don't need to save that. Okay, so another method of creating a time lapse is, and I'll show it out of Lightroom for the next one. Let's see. Okay, so, oh, you know what? Did I sync these images? I forgot if I synced these images before. Oh, I did. But okay, so this actually is a way to export. If you're just doing a straight time lapse without, so I'll actually go back to that Brooklyn one and show it this one because it's a better example. If you're just doing a straight time lapse without any on-one effects, straight out of Lightroom, then you would do this. Or you could always re-import that file. Like actually, I could probably do that right now. I'll show you how to do it. So I want to, okay, so let's say I just did that, the effects of the Space Needle. I want to find, where's my desk? I'm sitting here trying to find my stuff online here. You know what? This is going to take me too long. So I would basically go in and find that file that I exported all of those effects files to, those PSD files that have that effect on it. I would re-import them. I would just add them to my collection, and then you can export them. So actually, well, I'll pretend that I'm doing that. Let's pretend that all of these files have a perfect effect preset added to them. I would select all of them, and then I'm going to go into, this is kind of build up to this. You have to install specific presets in order for this to work. And Brian, do you have the information on that? Because I actually found them through you.
The URL to that earlier, it's just lrtimelapse.com, and there are these slideshow and video presets that Nicole's going to show you.
Okay, so the you have to. This is only in a Lightroom setting that you can do this, but you have presets, and I have the presets over here on the left. I went into the slideshow module, and let's just say I'm going to do 23976 because that's what I like to export mine as. So I have that set. It applied to all of my images. I'm going to click Export Video. I choose my location. Just, I add a new folder. And then down here you select the size, and I have it already pretty much set. Everything I'm doing is 720p, so I'm going to do 720p. You can do 1080p. I don't really use this one too much, so I haven't tested it out, but it's a really nice alternative to the QuickTime feature, or if you don't have Photoshop Extended, which I'm going to share in the next second here. So, and I guess you'd have to save as, you have to name them or something. Space Needle. There we go. And then I would just click export. I'm not going to do that now. I'm not going to let it have to work too hard. But once you export them, you will get a video. And Brian, if you want to go ahead and share that video of the Space Needle with the perfect effects. Okay, the next way of creating a time-lapse video from the files you already have is through Photoshop Extended, and I'm opening it up right now. I'll give that a second. Are there any questions while we're waiting here?
There's a question of how you get to that export video button from Marcel, and that you'll find that under the slideshow module. And where did you get the LR slideshow presets? If you go to lrtimelapse.com, if you look in your chat module, I put that link in there somewhere earlier, so you can get all that stuff. I believe it's all free. So.
Okay, so here I am in I'm in Photoshop CS5 Extended, and if you want to build a time lapse from within Photoshop Extended, you want to go to File, Open. Navigate to the file, and I'll go ahead. Let's see, I'm going to show, I haven't shown the tilt shift one yet. So you go to the file of, you know, all of those documents that have the time lapse sequence that you want, and you only have to click on one, and then you just click on the button down here that says Image Sequence, and then you click Open, and it'll work. Oh, sorry, you check again. Select your frame rate. I'll just leave it at 23976. Click OK. And so now I have it here, and the animation timeline is really where you see it, that you see you have it. Let me move my frame down. So as I scroll across, you can see it kind of moving. And Brian, if you want to go ahead and insert that, if you want to go ahead and insert the Seattle tilt shift one. And I believe you would export render video in order to actually create the video from this. So that's how you create it out of Photoshop Extended.